So good morning, and welcome to the Palantir 101 session. I'm Arlo Gunratnabraya. I'm an embedded analyst here in the London office. And this morning I want to take 40 or 50 minutes to tell you a little bit about the history of the company, the founding principles and core values that we follow in designing software towards analyzing big data. And then at the end, I will give you a product demonstration, really just to show you what this looks like in practice. But to start this morning, I'd like to tell you two stories. So the first story that I'm going to tell you this morning is about the game of chess. In 1997, Garry Kasparov, at the time the world's best player, lost a chess match against Deep Blue's IBM's Deep Blue computer. And this was really a fairly shocking event at the time. It marked a change in the landscape of chess, and things actually haven't changed since then. It's quite common these days that computer software can beat the best chess players. So following this, a new question was asked by Kasparov and by the community, which is, well, what happens now if we look at chess in a looser format where humans and computers can join forces and play together? And there was a such tournament, an experiment like this in 2005, organized by Kasparov, in which a team could be comprised of any number of human players or computers, single humans, to really test out this hypothesis of what would happen. And of course, what turned out is that a single player or a single team, Zach S, went on to win this entire tournament. And at the time, it was suspected that Zach S was actually Kasparov plus Deep Blue or some such combination. And in fact, this turned out to be wrong. So Zach S was actually two very average players with three very low-powered, very standard laptops running off-the-shelf software. And this is a little bit curious. What turns out here, it really is, to paraphrase Kasparov, is that the combination, amazingly, of weak player, weak machine, and strong process actually trumps strong machine, and amazingly even trumps strong player, strong machine, and weak process. And so really this is a story of, to harmonize a person and a machine, you really need to work on the process between these two entities. You really need to reduce the friction between these two parts of the system. The second story I want to tell you is about a Silicon Valley company of the late 90s, which I'm sure you're familiar with, PayPal. So PayPal was in the business, and still is in the business, of online financial transactions. And at the time, several other competing companies were in this space as well. So there were competing companies from some of the internet giants of the day, Yahoo and eBay. There were some competing companies from the financial giants of the day, Citibank and Western Union. And over time, PayPal really won over this entire space and became the dominant player in the market. And it's worth really understanding why this is. It turns out that the challenge here is not so much how you move money around online. It turns out that's actually quite an easy thing to do. The really hard thing to do is stop fraud. The really hard problem is how do you stop people ripping you off in these billions of transactions, and how do you find those transactions? And so the approach taken by the vast majority of players in this space was one of algorithms and a fairly black box approach. Let a computer design an algorithm or find an algorithm and run this algorithm over tens of billions of transactions to find those which are fraudulent. PayPal's approach was a little bit different in that they left a human analyst in this system to say, well, I'm going to let the human find which transactions are the fraudulent transactions, and I'm going to then just use the computer to extract similar transactions. And over time, PayPal's strategy worked. The strategy of the black box algorithm wasn't actually a sustainable business model at all. And really the reason for this is when you're fighting a human opponent, in this case, large organized crime groups, they're clever, and they change their strategy as they discover that you've found out what they're doing. And so reprogramming a computer every time they change their strategy to steal just doesn't scale. And so PayPal won. They sold in 2002 for $1.5 billion to eBay. And the group of people, PayPal alumni, who started the company and worked at the company became known as really prolific entrepreneurs and successful entrepreneurs throughout Silicon Valley. A group of these people then went on to found this company, Palantir. And so Palantir is really an expression of, or rather an extension of this idea of leaving a human analyst in the picture and allowing the software to do what it does well and extract information, and do this in a harmonious manner such that you minimize the friction between the analyst and the software. And so if there's one thing that I can really leave you with this morning, if there's one takeaway, it's that Palantir is an analytical infrastructure. And this means a few things. One, it means that it's not just a visualization tool. Two, it means that the platform is open. It's very easy to extend the platform through an open API into whatever direction you'd like, so you can further your organization's needs. And three, it doesn't own your data. This is not a platform in which you put your data for the data then to be completely owned by Palantir. This really sits on top of your existing infrastructure. And so I'd like to now move on a little bit and talk about the philosophy of how we built this software, and really point out again that the vast majority of thought and really the bulk of the engineering is somewhat below the waterline if we took the analogy to an iceberg. And what you see as an analyst is this tip of the iceberg, which is of course important, but is not the whole picture. So I'm going to talk about these 5 pillars, these 5 core ideas that we use behind Palantir, and these 5 core ideas that we really use to drive the way we think about this analysis problem. So the first of these ideas is data integration. Data integration means the ability to integrate structured data, unstructured data, and everything in between, every form of semi-structured, loose data or semi-structured forms. And so we do this in a manner that allows you to retain your data. We don't absorb it into one database, but we simply bring it into Palantir so that you can pursue your analysis in that platform. And so you really end up with this picture of whether your data is contained in your Excel spreadsheets, in your legacy databases, maybe it's open source data, maybe it's data outside of your organization, or maybe it's just loose data like emails and PDFs. All of this can come into Palantir and be represented as meaningful objects. The second pillar, and really the second bit of this foundation, is advanced search and discovery. And this means that Palantir gives you a very easy way of accessing this information. In its simplest form, this might look like a Google-type search bar, one that you're very familiar with, I'm sure, every day. But Palantir lets you do a lot more than this and ask much more complicated questions. So on top of just basic search, I can ask geospatial questions. I can ask, show me all the organizations around this city. I can ask temporal questions. What happened in the last year? I can ask relational questions. So I can say, show me every person Arlo knows and show me every person they know. I can ask questions about the data which I'm not even sure if it is a particular meaningful question. So I can ask questions like, are there any organizations that satisfy this criteria in the whole of the data set? And finally, I can ask persistent questions. So I can ask Palantir to alert me every time I log into the system. And I can ask Palantir to tell me, for example, if any new documents or any new objects about Arlo have been added to the system. So a next pillar really, and the next feature of the software is an algorithmic engine. And this is really to address the challenge of very, very large data sets. Increasingly, organizations are found to have just hundreds of billions of records of organized log files or transactional data. And this lets you run business rules in the background which integrate seamlessly with your Palantir stack. So this is powered by our Phoenix technology, giving you a distributed data node. And this just really integrates completely seamlessly, so these jobs run in the background and you get your results without having to do any further work straight into your Palantir analysis. Let's talk a little bit now about knowledge management. So at Palantir, we view the fact that your analysis is really a piece of data in its own right. And this means that you should be able to treat this as a piece of data and ask questions about the data that makes up your analysis. So rather than just dumping data into Palantir, we allow you to ask questions, meaningful questions on the data that are relevant to your analytical needs. And so this means being able to ask questions about the data source. You can ask questions about the reliability of the data source. And so, as credibility of information changes over time, you can go back and say, well, why do we think this? Is this still a viable solution to this problem, or a viable kind of conclusion of this analysis? And what did this look like last week or last month? And so, of course, you can query the dates. You can say, how has this picture changed? How recent is this information? You could use this property, of course, also to ask a slightly different question, say, show me all the data of the last year and only the data of the last year. And then you can also filter by any object of interest within Palantir. So you can say questions like, show me all data relating to Arlo. Show me all data relating to my organization of interest. What other pieces of data are linked to these documents and chunks of data? Something that was really built in from the start at Palantir was the ability to collaborate with the software. And this is something we've thought about a lot, and it's really a kind of core value and a core principle of how we work and how we think. The way we've thought about this is really to implement a way of collaborating which doesn't force you to compromise on the data. So typically to collaborate, you imply a need to actually share data across an organization or with different people. And occasionally, people get worried that that's going to impinge on the privacy of that data. Because we've thought about this really early on and built it right into the core of the system, you can very safely share your data in the absolute knowledge that you will never share a piece of sensitive data that somebody else shouldn't look at. And this allows you to do interesting things like collaborate throughout your organization at different levels of clearance or access, again, in the knowledge that nobody is going to share or ever see a piece of data that they shouldn't. Of course, this also means that you can collaborate not only throughout your organization, but over borders or even between organizations, again, in this knowledge that any information that you have which cannot be shared beyond just your working group stays just within your working group. Another idea that I should point out here is that Palantir lets you explore ideas before you share them. So this is really an idea driven by version control in software development. And so the way this works is that within Palantir, you can explore an analysis idea, you can probe out that idea, and only if you are happy with it do you need to share it. Otherwise, you're working within this self-contained sandbox and for you to pretty much do what you like. So a few final thoughts before we move on to a demo here. Palantir is scalable. So our smallest deployments are at the order of tens of gigabytes, and this scales up to hundreds of terabytes or petabytes of data. Palantir is secure. We're already deployed at some of the most sensitive institutions around the world, and as we were just discussing, we've really baked this secure collaboration right into the software, so it's very hard, in fact, to share anything that you shouldn't. Palantir is very low risk. This is not a solution which takes a year to build and a year to deploy. This is a solution that we can deploy literally in a matter of days. And then finally, Palantir is proven technology. We have around 250 deployments on every continent of the Earth, excluding Antarctica. We have around 10,000 analysts currently. And really, we operate in a vast range of spaces where we're helping organizations achieve their mission objectives, both in intelligence, military, health, and of course, our philanthropic endeavors. So what I'd like to do now is slightly change gear and show you guys a live demo of what this looks like and really try and reinforce some of these things we've talked about as we go. So the context for this demo is sort of a day in the life of a Palantir analyst. I'm going to be looking into alleged criminal organization operating out of Sweden and allegedly funding a terrorist organization by means of a money laundering ring. I'd also like to point out at this point, of course, that this is purely fictional data. So this is what Palantir looks like when you log in. Here is this search bar that we talked about a little bit, and of course I could just type a search term in here and start. At the top here you see a range of applications, and these can be added to as needed using our OpenAPI. I'm going to start this investigation by going over to the collaboration application here. You see I have a little 1 here. So let's click here, and I see that a colleague has shared 2 objects with me, asking me to take a look. So I'm going to simply click on these and see what we've got here. OK. So the first is an intelligence report by the police telling me that Paolo, this person Paolo, has been arrested for suspected fraudulent activity, and that he also seems to claim that, in fact, our person of interest is an Eritrean national named Al-Jabbar. Let's have a look at our second document of interest. So this report is some human intelligence alleging that there is a money laundering scheme being operated out of Sweden funding Al-Shabaab and being operated essentially by an Eritrean national. So of course at this point it doesn't mean to say that these 2 people are the same, but we should certainly explore a little bit more. Let's go back to our first document. You probably noticed here that this person's name is highlighted in blue. And what this is in Palantir is the ability to tag and extract information, structure information from a loose document. So if I hover over this, you will see, in fact, that this has been tagged by one of my colleagues as a person. And I'm going to show you right now how this works. So I can continue this sort of virtual highlighting, if you like, to extract a little bit more structure from this document. So let's go ahead and tag Al-Jabbar here. So I'm going to highlight his name, right-click, and add a tag. So at this point, we're really seeing some of the power of search and discovery within Palantir. I didn't know that Al-Jabbar seems to already exist. Admittedly, the spelling is a little different, but at this point, I'm going to assume they're the same people. If I was wrong, I could very happily go back and change this and tag him as a separate person. So Palantir is now just asking me which title I'd like to keep. I'll keep the old one. We can also do a similar thing for properties of a person. So I can specify that he's an Eritrean by highlighting this word and dragging it onto his name. So we'll just type in nationality. And I can also use a similar mechanism to express links between people. So I can drag Al-Jabbar onto Paolo, and I can add a link between them. And I'm just going to say here that they are known associates. OK. So a few of you may have noticed my graph application flashing. We're going to click over to this now. So this is really my link analysis application. Lets me take a slightly different view on the data. So here we go. This is what we've just done. Here is this Paolo person. Here is Al-Jabbar, and we express the idea that they're known associates. I can get a little bit more information on both of them by using one of the helpers in the side. So a helper is really our internal term for an extension to the Palantir platform using this open API that we've talked about a couple of times. So here in my selection helper, I can see that Paolo has an address. We also know his nationality. We even have a Twitter handle for him. We have a mugshot, and we have his known associates and this related document that he was found in. Similarly, for Al-Jabbar, I can see what we know about him on the side here. I see that he's the owner of a phone number and an address. And I see also that there's these 92 flights. So I'm going to ask a slightly different question now. I want to know actually what we know about Al-Jabbar. And I want to see everything that's linked to him. So I'm going to use a tool called Search Around. And so Search Around lets me find every linked piece of information in the system to an entity. So I could search around for entities. I could search around for linked documents, any document that's related to Al-Jabbar. I could search around for linked events. Or I can do a slightly more complicated query. And in this case, I'm going to just ask the system to show me everything we know about Al-Jabbar, everything that's linked to him. And so I see I get a whole load of stuff back. So at this point, I can use another helper called the histogram helper to really get a sense of what it is we're looking at here without having to trawl through this graph node by node. I see that we have 5 entities on the graph, 2 of which are people. I see that we have a credit card, so this credit card is owned by Al-Jabbar, a location, and a phone number. And I see these 42 flights that we noticed were linked to him. So I'd like to know a little bit more about these flights and I'd like to find out where he's been going. So I'm going to now ask Palantir, well, tell me more about these flights. I can do this by right-clicking in the histogram, and I'm going to simply drill down to the current selection. That's Palantir's way of saying, show me only those objects. And so here I see the airlines that he's been using, and I can see which cities he's been visiting in Europe. I can see he's been to Spain, I can see he's been to Belgium, and I can see he's been to Sweden as well. And he's been to these places quite a lot of times. So at this point, I'm going to take a slight step back and remind you that the suggestion here in the original document that we read was that he was operating a drug smuggling ring out of organizations in Europe. So I'm getting a little bit suspicious about why he's visiting these cities so much. And I'd like to really call upon the search power of Palantir now to ask a slightly more abstract question, which will be, show me all the organizations, or are there any organizations in the system which are either in Sweden, Belgium, or Spain. And I can do this with a filter. These filters can also be saved and shared within your organization. So if you look at this filter here, we're looking for any object of type organization. But I'm specifying that I would like these objects to be either in Sweden, or Spain, or Belgium. And I can just click Add to Graph to see what results I get back. And indeed, I do get some results back. So let's just tidy up a little bit here. Let's grid these. And again, I'd like to know what else we know about these organizations. Why are they in the system? So I'm going to just search around for linked entities at this point. OK. So I get a load of things back. I can go back to my histogram helper and get a sense of what it is we're really looking at. And I see actually very quickly that all of these organizations have been linked to drug busts. I also have 2 people linked to these organizations. So let's have a little bit of a closer look at them and just see if there's anything that really stands out. So I'm going to drill down again. Here we are on these people. I can use the selection helper to get a real handle on what information we have on them. And I see that one of them has a phone number. The other one, all we know apparently is just the name and the organization they're linked to. But I'm going to put this guy's phone number on the graph just for a complete picture of what exactly is going on here. And I can do this from the selection helper. I can just select this phone number and simply add it to the graph here. OK. So this is beginning to look quite interesting, but as far as we can tell, there's still no real link between this structure here, these organizations involved in this drug business, and Al-Jabbar. So let's ask now a slightly different question. Let's see if there's any other information geospatially in the system that could be of relevance. I'd like to know if we have any reports, any intelligence reports or police reports around these organizations within the system. So I'm going to drag them to the map and let them go. And I can see now straight away that they are all indeed in Europe. I can zoom in a little bit. And at this point, I'm going to ask Palantir, do we know of any intelligence reports around these organizations? So to do this, I'm going to use a map layer. This is just simply points over these organizations. I'm going to create a radius search around these points. And I'm going to search within, say, 20 kilometers. And as I said, I'm really specifically interested in any intel here. So I'm going to look for anything of type document. And I can just run this search. And I get 4 results back. So they're a little hard to see on the map right now. If I turn on this heat map, you'll see that we get a bit of a concentration over here. So this is the one that's returned them. So let's zoom in here so we can just see exactly what's going on. Again, I can use some helpers here, the histogram helper in particular, to really drill down on these documents. And then the selection helper to investigate their content. So at this point, I'm really just flicking through the documents without needing to go back to the browser or the graph, just to get a sense of what we have in the system and see if anybody else has extracted any relevant information here. So the first document looks like It's probably unrelated to our inquiry here. It looks like some kind of insurance fraud. The second document is somewhat interesting. There's a freight forwarder that's been investigated. It looks slightly irregular in terms of its customs declaration. The third document is something to do with a freight driver along Highway E20. This might be relevant later. It's interesting to note that this was linked to the original location where this investigation started. And our final document here actually has a telephone number that's been tagged in it by somebody else. So let's have a look at this one a little bit more carefully. It looks like there's a telephone that's been found in a stolen van. And interestingly, the phone bill has been requested for this number. So I'm going to go ahead and simply add this telephone back to the graph so we can explore this in a little bit more detail. I can right-click, and I can just simply add this tag back to the graph. So here's our telephone. So I'm going to just space things out a little bit so we get a really clear picture of what we've got going on here. So we saw that the bills have been requested. I'm going to search around for these events. So a telephone call is an event in Palantir. And I'm just going to see if this links to anything on the graph and see how many we have and what this really looks like. OK, here's what we get back. So this is pretty interesting. It looks like we actually now have a link between Al-Jabbar and this drug organization here through these two telephones. Admittedly, not directly, but through this cluster of telephone transactions here. I'd like to know a little bit more about what's going on here and really get a sense of what we've got going on geographically and temporally. So I'm going to take these telephone calls back to the map and just see what we've got going on. See if there's anything that stands out or if there's anything that really catches my eye. So the first thing here, let me make these circles a little bigger so you guys can see them. So the first thing that's really apparent here is that all of these phone calls seem to be along one road. Interestingly, this is also the E20, and we noticed a report earlier on that had mentioned that. So this is really looking a little odd. Let's have a look at how this looks over time. I can use another helper called the timeline helper to show me very quickly that actually all of these events have taken place in the space of about 1 month. So yeah, there's definitely something a little bit odd going on here. I'm going to do another geospatial search now, and this time I'm going to search along a route. So in Palantir, I can simply ask, show me all the events along this route, or show me everything we know along this route, and I can make the route any arbitrary path I like with this line here. So I'm going to search with a buffer of, let's say 3 kilometers. So you see this shaded region around this road. And at this point, I don't really know what I'm looking for, actually. So again, I'm going to just say, search the entire system. Show me everything that may be of relevance to my inquiry here along this path. So I'm just going to click search. And I get quite a lot of results back, but let's keep going. Let's ask Palantir to find me everything we know. OK, so I get almost 1,000 new results back, which sounds like a lot, but again, it's very easy for me to just sift through this information and extract what's useful here. So it looks like I have a few documents and some text messages and so on. So let me have another look at these documents and see if these are any different to the ones we already got. No, so it looks like they're absolutely the same. I'm going to just run that search again, and this time searching a slightly wider boundary. So let's make the search, say, 5 kilometers. This still feels pretty reasonable. 5 kilometers from a road is actually not very far. So again, I get a whole load of new stuff back. Interesting. So this time, within this boundary, I do have a result that I've not seen yet, which is this zoo, which feels like it's probably irrelevant given that it's a zoo and we're looking at organizations trading drugs. But we should look at this a little bit more closely and understand why we have it in our system here. So let's drill down to this. So we've isolated just the zoo. And we can go again to the selection helper and have a look at what we know here. So we have the organization name, we have their profession, and we have this related document which will tell us hopefully a bit more about why it's in the system. So I'm going to click on that and have a read here. So this is a piece of human intelligence alleging that the zoo is being used by an organized criminal group to launder money out of Sweden onto an unknown country somewhere in the Middle East. The person apparently doing this is known as AJ, and this is really looking quite suspicious now, because this guy has the same initials as our central person of interest. Of course, initials aren't enough to say they are the same person, but again, similarly to earlier on, we can go ahead and start extracting some information here. So rather than saying these two people are the same people, I'm going to create a new person this time. And again, similar to earlier on, I'm going to add their nationality. So this is just actually a really powerful workflow where I can start extracting some information from these loose documents that we can really drill into on the graph. And I'm going to express this idea that he's somehow linked to the zoo. I'm going to use a very simple link here. We're not really sure exactly what's going on. OK. I see also here that bank records have been requested from the zoo. So hopefully this will help us really clarify what's going on. So let's go back to the graph now one final time and really see if we can get a full handle on what we've got here. So at this point, the graph is looking a little messy. I'm going to tidy things up a little bit by selecting everything. I'm going to go to the histogram, and I'm just going to remove the things we don't need. So we can get rid of some of these events. We don't need those anymore. And when I do this, I'm not deleting things from Palantir. I'm really just tidying things up from my graph so that I get a really clear picture of what it is we're actually looking at. I can go back to any previous stage if I want. And you'll have noticed I haven't actually ever clicked on the Save button either. This is this idea of knowledge management. Palantir is actually saving permanently everything I do, and I can go back to any state of the investigation. So let me arrange these a little bit more attractively. And let's go and have a look at our zoo and see what these transactions are. So I'm going to, again, search around. I'm looking for transactions which are events. So I'm just going to click the event search around. And this is quite interesting now. We're definitely revealing something. I have a load of organizations come back that I've not seen before, and some links to the previous organizations that I found. So let's take a look at these organizations. We'll drill down to them, get a sense of what exactly it is we've got here. Let me arrange them hierarchically as well, and drag them a little bit off to the side. So immediately I see I have 4 organizations that are not involved at all. And I can see the profession of these organizations very easily as well. So I see that we have some chemical suppliers, which we hadn't come across, and we have these freight forwarders. And then we have some fairly expected organizations, given that we're dealing with a zoo here. So I'm going to, again, just delete these 4 organizations that are not involved in this picture. They're not lost from the system. They're just not relevant at this point. So I'd like to get a sense of what these transactions look like here. And to do this, I can use an extension of Palantir that was written using the Open API called the Flows Helper. And this is really going to let me just see what the flow of money looks like through this structure. So I'm just going to go ahead and turn on the Flows Helper. And so here we see, as a flow of red dots, money flowing from these organizations at the top through the zoo and onto these organizations at the bottom, which is a little suspicious. And certainly worth really digging into. So I'm going to go one step further. I'm going to take the highest value payment, and I'm going to use the event matrix to really get a event-by-event picture of how these transactions are evolving over time. So I select the organization on one side of this transaction, and I'm going to select the organization on the other side of this transaction. And I'm just going to use our event matrix to get a picture of what these transactions actually look like. And so a fairly interesting pattern is actually emerging here in that the zoo seems to be paying the chemical company and then receiving money from the freight company. And this pattern is actually repeated throughout the entire chain of transaction events. So this certainly looks like it could be money laundering. At this point, I'd like to show you 1 or 2 more features before we share these results back out to the wider community. So the first thing is that my flows helper here is able to flow any exchange of objects within Palantir due to its fairly open nature. So I can flow money, but I can also flow phone calls. And I'm going to do that. I just want to see a little bit more about what we've got going on in this phone call structure here, in this organization here. So I'm just going to change the flows helper from payment amounts to call counts, just to get a handle of what we've got here. Okay, so this is actually also fairly interesting. We see that Al-Jabbar never makes a phone call into this network. He only ever receives phone calls from it. And ditto, this guy, Elliot Hodges, on the other side, actually only ever receives phone calls as well. So very, very quickly, I've identified that this phone is of particular interest. We don't yet know who the owner is, but it's certainly worth pursuing a little bit more about what's going on with this phone. And then, as a final thought and a final thing that I might want to explore during this analysis is the fact that this AJ person we found linked to the zoo down here could well be the same as this Al-Jabbar person, the guy we started with and the guy of central interest. And if I want to explore this picture in Palantir, I can do this really easily. So I can select them both. I can right-click and resolve these two people. I'll stick with Al-Jabbar as a full name for now. And I can resolve these two people, and now I get a picture of what this organization looks like, what this structure looks like if they are the same people. And indeed, it certainly looks in this picture like Al-Jabbar is really central to this whole money laundering and organized crime circle. Of course, as we've discussed a few times, if this proves not to be the case or I change my mind before sharing to a wider audience within Palantir, I can very, very easily undo this step. So I can right-click and unresolve them and simply revert back to the stage we were at when we thought about these two guys as separate people. So at this point, I'm quite happy that this looks like a very worthwhile line of investigation. We certainly have something a little bit suspicious going on, and it's really worth sharing these results back out into the organization. So very quickly, I can go back to my collaboration app and tell my friend Joe that this was interesting, so I can send him a message back. And I can share this with Joe, but I can also share this with any groups of people, supervisors, or teams of Palantir users. And then finally, I can also share these results outside of Palantir very quickly. So Palantir actually takes snapshots of my workflow throughout. And this allows me really quickly to share these results with supervisors or anybody who's not using Palantir. So I can take just a few key slides of my workflow throughout this investigation and export these. So let's call this Al-Jabbar money laundering. And immediately I can export this to PowerPoint. Where the slides have already been set up to share to a wider audience. Now, of course, I can still go ahead and edit some of these titles, but the point is the actual workflow that I took through this has already been put into a PowerPoint presentation for me. So I'd like to close on a few remarks of what you really saw there. I started the investigation by looking at some documents that a colleague had shared with me. And then I used my analyst insight to really drill into these documents and search through the data, sift through the data to extract meaningful information to put together a picture of what was really going on. And then finally, I was able to very, very easily and very quickly share results back out into the community, both within Palantir and to anybody outside of Palantir via PowerPoint. So I hope that this 101 session has been helpful for you and has given you a bit of insight into how our platform looks and really the values that we hold to drive it forward. We've got a great day of talks ahead. A lot of talks go into plenty of these topics in much more detail. If you would like to speak to any of us individually, we're very easy to find. We're all wearing these black track jackets. And so I wish you a really great GovCon. Thank you very much.